Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Sunday school class called C.S. Lewis Beyond Narnia. So we are now in the middle of C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy. So we're looking at Lewis's other fictional works beyond the Chronicles of Narnia. And so we're beginning this class with a focus on his Ransom trilogy, commonly known as the Space Trilogy. That's how it's published, but by now I think you know my reasons for why I don't call it the Space Trilogy anymore. The true C.S. Lewis fans would not call it the Space Trilogy. But I was not here last week. So you guys did a combined class with Ernie Seeger, correct? Did that go all right? Okay, excellent. So it is good to be back with you. You might recall the last lesson that I taught was 2 weeks ago when I summarized the plot of Perelandra, which is the second volume in the C.S. Lewis Ransom Trilogy series. So we're going to continue our discussion on Perelandra today. We're going to unpack some of the literary and theological themes from Perelandra today. So here's what we'll be focusing on. I've been using this book, which was just published last year, called Life on the Silent Planet, edited by Rhys Laverty, and it has several contributors that are leading C.S. Lewis scholars from around the world. This is published by Davenant Press. I'm a huge fan of Davenant. They've been sort of like a seminary after seminary for me. So I highly recommend pretty much everything by Davenant, the Davenant Institute and Davenant Press. But this book, compilation of essays that look at the key themes of each of the books within the Ransom trilogy. And there are 3 essays in this book that address Perelandra. And these are the ones we're going to be looking at today. So the first chapter, which is chapter 4 in the book, is called Enjoyment and Contemplation, The Green Lady, Self-Knowledge, and Growth in Maturity by Christiana Hale. Then the next chapter, chapter 5, is called The Devil Went Down to Venus. Looking for a soul to steal. Lessons from the Unman by Bethel McGrew. And then the next chapter, chapter 6, is called A Taste of Paradise. Naming, restraining, and embracing pleasure on Perelandra. And this one's written by the editor himself, Rhys Laverty. So those are the 3 chapters that I intend to unpack with you this morning. There is a lot of material in these chapters. These are great chapters. So to summarize that, we're looking at enjoyment and contemplation. You might remember those themes from my previous lessons on C.S. Lewis. Evil, the nature of evil, and pleasure. Those are the core themes that we're going to be looking at from these essays on Perelandra this morning. So on that first chapter there on enjoyment and contemplation, to refresh your memory if you were here for previous lessons when I addressed these themes, I'm going to use an excerpt from C.S. Lewis's little essay called Meditation in a Tool Shed. Do you remember me talking about this essay previously? Here's how it opens. Lewis says, I was standing today in the dark tool shed. The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door, there came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light, with specks of dust floating in it, was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch black. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. Then I moved, so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no tool shed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside. And beyond that, 90-odd million miles away, the sun. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences. So you understand the concept here, looking along the beam versus looking at the beam. According to C.S. Lewis, these 2 approaches to looking correspond to 2 modes of knowledge. And these 2 modes of knowledge I've called contemplation and enjoyment. This distinction was very, very important in the thought of C.S. Lewis. It recurs in a lot of his writings. And we see this concept expressed in Perelandra as well. So we could say that the mode of knowledge called contemplation corresponds to looking at the beam. This would be like intellectual analysis. It would be logical reflection. Whereas looking along the beam, that's enjoyment. That would be like subjective experience or encounter or imagination. And Lewis is not saying that one mode of knowledge is better than another. These are both valid modes of knowledge, and we use them all the time. And so there are some examples that you could think of when, let's talk about enjoyment, because this is the one that we're going to highlight here. Think about like an author who is caught up in the moment in the midst of creative writing, right? It's like, it's almost a sense of inspiration, not in the theological sense of that term, but you know, like where it seems like the writing comes from outside of yourself, and it's like you don't even have control over what's going down on the paper or on the screen. That inspiration behind creative writing is sort of the sensation of enjoyment, being caught up in the moment, that experiential knowledge. Or how about like when you're sitting on a park bench and you're just taking in the sights around you. You hear the birds chirping, you hear the leaves rustling, right? You're not necessarily analyzing the process of photosynthesis or the mechanics of how a bird is able to chirp by means of, vocalization and aerodynamics and so forth. You're not studying it scientifically. You're just taking it in and enjoying it. How about that morning sip of coffee? You're not thinking, okay, so if I'm going to get through today after this many hours of sleep, I'm going to need this many doses of, this many milligrams of caffeine or whatever. No, you're just enjoying your cup of coffee. Or think about listening to like a beautiful concerto or something like that. There is a place for analyzing each of these experiences. But to enter into the experience, to enjoy the experience, is fundamentally a different mode of knowledge. Lewis thinks that in the modern age in particular, we have denigrated this mode of knowledge. He calls it materialistic reductionism. The idea that we reduce all things to their component parts. We study quantity rather than quality. We've lost touch with the grander sense of purpose or meaning or wonder. And this is a central critique that we see in a lot of Lewis's writings, including in Perelandra. And so we can see, even from the beginning of the novel, Lewis is trying to recover a sense of enjoyment by immersing us in the atmosphere of Venus. I want to share with you a quote from C.S. Lewis's final book that was published posthumously the year after his death in 1964, The Discarded Image, where he is explaining the medieval worldview and the significance of all of the symbolism within the medieval worldview. And he talks about the significance of the symbolism of Venus, planet Venus, the goddess Venus, one and the same even. Here's what he says. Modern readers sometimes discuss whether, when Jupiter or Venus is mentioned by a medieval poet, he means the planet or the deity. It is doubtful whether the question usually admits of an answer. All three things, the visible planet in the sky, the source of the influence, and the god, generally acted as a unity upon his mind. Now, from my previous lessons, how many of you remember me talking about the concept of donegality? Remember donegality? This was the central theme behind Michael Ward's theory about planet Narnia. So each of the books within the Chronicles of Narnia has its own particular donegality, its own flavor, its own atmosphere, its own feel or vibe. And so what we see in Perelandra is Lewis is trying to communicate the donegality of Venus, planet Venus. And we see that really from the beginning of Ransom's arrival on Perelandra, planet Venus. Here's what the essay says. When Ransom arrives on Perelandra, he arrives as one being reborn. Venus is inextricably tied to the material, the life-giving fruitfulness of, maternal, the life-giving fruitfulness of motherhood. Thus, it is no surprise that Ransom himself only arrives on Perelandra through a physical and spiritual rebirth. This is really key because, as I talked about when we discussed Out of the Silent Planet, Mars represents masculinity. Venus represents femininity. And so a lot of the feminine themes and symbols are expressed in this novel, Perelandra. And we'll see how that's expressed in the novel. Now, at one point, we see a conversation between Ransom and the Green Lady. Before Ransom's arrival on planet Perelandra, the Green Lady's experience of life had been one of entirely, purely enjoyment. She hadn't yet been awakened to the different mode of knowledge, which we call contemplation, logical analysis, and we could say meta-reflection, perhaps. This is a new thing for her in her conversations with Ransom. Prior to that, all she had done was taken in the life that God had given her, Maleldil had given her on planet Venus, and she sees the rolling waves, the fertile islands that are rolling over the waves, the animals that obey her command delightfully. It was a life of sheer enjoyment. But now Ransom invites her to think about life from a contemplative perspective, how things might be or how they might have been otherwise, the role of her own choice in her experiences on this planet. And so, as the dialogue develops, she says, "I see it now," she said presently. "It is very strange to say one is young at the moment one is speaking, but tomorrow I shall be older, and then I shall say I was young today. You are quite right. This is great wisdom you are bringing, O piebald man." So a couple things here. Number one, young and old. Do you remember from last time what I meant by that terminology or what the green lady means by it? When she says young and old, she's not talking about age in a literal sense. It's her way of trying to describe the movement from simplicity and naivety to wisdom and maturity. She also refers to Ransom as the piebald man. Do you remember why? Because when he arrives on Venus, half of his body is sunburnt, right? So it looks like he's two distinct colors, and that's like what a piebald animal is, right? They're this blotchy, two different colors. So that's what she refers to him as in this novel. So then Ransom responds, "What do you mean?" And she responds, "This looking backward and forward along the line and seeing how a day has one appearance as it comes to you, and another when you are in it, and a third when it has gone past, like the waves." Does that sound kind of familiar to you? Like the meditation in a tool shed, looking along the beam versus looking at the beam? Your perspective of the beam can change depending on the time or your location or how you're analyzing it. Then Ransom says, "But you are very little older than yesterday." So he's thinking of old and young in literal terms here, right? And she says, "How do you know that?" "I mean," said Ransom, "a night is not a very long time. You're not much older after 24 hours. She thought again and then spoke suddenly, her face lightening. "I see it now," she said. "You think times have lengths. A night is always a night, whatever you do in it, as from this tree to that is always so many paces, whether you take them quickly or slowly. I suppose that is true in a way, but the waves do not always come at equal distances. I see that you come from a wise world, if this is wise. I have never done it before, stepping outside of life into the alongside and looking at oneself, living as if one were not alive. Do they all do that in your world, piebald?" So look at what she's doing. She's experiencing life along the beam, and she's being invited to step outside of that and look at the beam, to think about the nature of choice, the nature of providence. These are the ideas that she is awakened to in her conversations with Ransom. But it turns out that this new contemplative mode of knowledge is a double-edged sword. It can awaken her to great wisdom, but there's also a danger of falling into temptation and sin. Because what we see as the narrative develops is Satan's exploitation of contemplation. So Satan is embodied in the character of Weston. You may remember Weston is the villain of this story. And what happens to Weston after he lands on Perelandra? He's possessed, right? He calls upon this so-called life force to enter into him, and it does. But it's not the benevolent force he thinks it is. It turns out to be a demonic force. And so his body is essentially taken over by this malevolent spiritual being, and the character is from then on referred to as the unman, because he's not human at all, even though he's sort of wearing Weston as a skin suit. But again, here is what Lewis has to say about enjoyment and contemplation in another section of his essay. The enjoyment and the contemplation of our inner activities are incompatible. You cannot hope and also think about hoping at the same moment. For in hope, we look to hope's object, and we interrupt this by, so to speak, turning around to look at the hope itself. Of course, the two activities can and do alternate with great rapidity, but they are distinct and incompatible. What Lewis is saying here is you cannot enjoy and contemplate at the same time. These two modes of knowledge cannot occupy the same space at the same time. They're both valid, they're both appropriate in their own way, but they are mutually exclusive. Think about it this way. This was an analogy that occurred to me as I was reading this section of the essay. You guys know the story of Jesus walking on water? And then how does the Apostle Peter respond when he sees Jesus walking on water? He steps out of the boat, and he starts walking on water towards Jesus as well. But then what happens to Peter? He looks down, he starts to panic, and he starts sinking. And he cries out to Jesus for help. What happens is his gaze had turned away from Jesus and onto himself. It turned away from the object of his faith and onto his own faith. And in the process, his own faith weakened. And he started sinking below the water. I think this is a great illustration of what happens when we turn inappropriately to the contemplative mode of knowledge. There's an appropriate place for it. But we're going to see expressed in Perelandra the dangers of the misuse of contemplation. In particular, when we turn inward on our own virtues. This is the temptation that the unman actually seeks to exploit and use to lure the green lady into disobedience. Now, how does that happen? Well, it's similar to these words of C.S. Lewis in the next book we'll be looking at after the Ransom trilogy. We'll be looking at the Screwtape Letters. Now, if you know the dialogue of the Screwtape Letters, it's written from the perspective of a senior demon writing to a junior demon. So you sort of have to think in reverse, right? Bad is good and good is bad when you're reading the Screwtape Letters. But take a look at this piece of advice from Screwtape to the junior demon Wormwood. In all activities of mind which favor our demonic cause, encourage the patient, that's the object of the demonic attack, encourage the patient to be unself-conscious and to concentrate on the object. In other words, if it's a sinful pleasure, encourage the human to focus just on that pleasure, just on that delight. But in all activities favorable to the enemy, that is God, bend his mind back on itself. Let an insult or a woman's body so fix his attention outward that he does not reflect, I am now entering into the state called anger or the state called lust. Contrariwise, let the reflection, my feelings are now growing more devout or more charitable, so fix his attention inward that he no longer looks beyond himself to see our enemy or his own neighbors. In other words, be self-forgetful in your sin, but self-reflective in your virtue. That's the strategy of Satan here. That is the same strategy that the unman uses with the green lady on Venus. And so think about what the unman says to the green lady in the course of trying to tempt her. So if you've read the novel, what he does is he encourages her to think about what could be achieved if she disobeys the command of Maleldil. So just to refresh your memory, there is one prohibition that Maleldil, God, has given to the green lady on Venus. What is that one prohibition? The one thing she's not allowed to do. She's not allowed to stay overnight or dwell on the fixed island. All the other islands on Perelandra, they're like floating, vegetation mats. They're on tops of the waves. But there's one fixed island that she is not allowed to dwell on. She can visit it during daylight hours, but she can't stay there. And she can't stay overnight. But the unman tries to persuade her that maybe Maleldil really wants you to disobey this command in order for you to become your own person, to achieve your own independence, to create your own identity. And that's how you can actually enter into a more mature relationship with not only Maleldil, but also with your own husband, the king, who's away from most of the storyline. He doesn't show up until the very end. And so he's trying to encourage her to think about all of the potential benefits of making her own choice, doing the heroic thing. Even if it seems to be an act of disobedience, it's actually an act of love. And so what he's trying to do is encourage her to see not the obedience itself, but to imagine herself obeying. What would it look like for her to be this kind of person? And at one point during the course of his temptation, he starts telling her all these stories of heroic women on earth who went against social conventions and traditions and moral commandments in order to do the self-sacrificial, the heroic thing that benefited others in the end, even if it cost her her own reputation, her own life. And so what he's trying to do in the end is trying to foster a sense of pride in her own humility. This is the danger of being self-reflective in our own virtue. When you become self-reflective in your own virtue, you start not thinking about obedience itself, but you're self-obeying. That actually has a counter. It's counter-effective in achieving humility in yourself. It produces the opposite result. It fosters pride. And then, this is what really worries Ransom. He realizes that the unman's temptations are starting to work. They start to have an effect on the Green Lady. And here's what Ransom, this is what his inner dialogue, his inner monologue. He says, the expression on her face, revealed in the sudden light, was one that he had not seen there before. Her eyes were not fixed on the narrator, that is, the unman. As far as that went, her thoughts might have been 1,000 miles away. Her lips were shut and a little pursed. Her eyebrows were slightly raised. He had not yet seen her look so like a woman of our own race, a human. Yet her expression was one he had not very often met on earth, except as he realized with a shock on the stage. Like a tragedy queen was the disgusting comparison that arose in his mind. A very good tragedy queen, no doubt. The heroine of a very great tragedy, very nobly played by an actress who was a good woman in real life, by earthly standards an expression to be praised, even to be revered. But remembering all that he had read in her countenance before, the unself-conscious radiance, the frolic sanctity, the depth of stillness that reminded him sometimes of infancy and sometimes of extreme old age, while the hard youth and valiancy of face and body denied both, he found this new expression horrifying. The fatal touch of invited grandeur, of enjoyed pathos, the assumption, however slight, of a role, seemed a hateful vulgarity. Perhaps she was doing no more. He had good hope that she was doing no more than responding in a purely imaginative fashion to this new art of story or poetry. But she'd better not. And for the first time, the thought, "This can't go on," formulated itself in his mind. And so what is Ransom telling us here? Ransom is saying that she's being taken in, or so it would appear. It seems that the Green Lady is starting to imagine herself as the characters of one of the unman's stories. Now, I took this dialogue and I thought, I wonder what that expression would actually look like on her face. So I asked ChatGPT this question, and here's what I got. If you want to know, that's the look, okay? That's the look of the tragedy queen. And so we can see that there's this sort of this heroic sense of tragedy on her face. And this is what has Ransom worried. He's like, this cannot go on. Ransom is on the side of God, and he recognizes that it is his job to ensure that she does not fall into the temptation. And so this is what it finally inspires Ransom to realize he's going to have to fight. And I'm going to come back to that theme in the next chapter that we look at. But there are two takeaways that I want to highlight here from this chapter before we move into the next one. True humility focuses outward. That's one of the key takeaways that we see from this theme. As we understand the proper role of enjoyment and the proper role of contemplation in the Christian life, true humility must focus outward. The more you look at yourself being humble, the less humble you're going to be. The second takeaway here is true obedience is in the present. So the idea here is, I think we've all had this experience of fantasizing about being the hero of some story or some event. And it's great to think of ourselves in that role, but the thing is, there's actually no real virtue in doing that. This is what the unman is trying to tempt the Green Lady to do, to imagine herself as the hero of her own story. The problem is, that's not true obedience. True obedience is what happens right now, in the moment. The providence that God has put you into is where real obedience happens. And the more you think about yourself obeying, the less obedient you're going to be. And so this is why it's helpful for us to keep in mind a proper sense of both enjoyment and contemplation as we think about our obedience and our own sin. To put it simply, enjoy your obedience but contemplate your sin. I think that would be a good way of simplifying the takeaway from that. And so here's one of the concluding quotes from this chapter. In the end, all of our contemplating of ourselves or our own thoughts or our own actions cannot hope to contend with the simple joy of obedience in the present moment. To say with the green lady, I am his beast, and all his biddings are joys. I am his beast, and all of his biddings are joys. So that's one of the lines of the green lady, and this is a great expression of the enjoyment of obedience. So that's our first chapter on enjoyment and contemplation. The next chapter is about the nature of evil. Now, it begins with an illustration of this particular individual. His name is Michael Cassidy. How many of you are familiar with the story of Michael Cassidy from about a year or so ago, a little more? He was the individual who defaced a monument in the Iowa State Capitol building. Do you guys remember the story of a statue in the Iowa State Capitol building about a year or so ago? It was a statue of Satan, put there by the Church of Satan. He saw that statue as an act of blasphemy. And he went into the building, and he tore it down, and he turned himself in. And he said, that was an expression of pure evil, and I was not going to stand for it. Does anybody remember this headline? No? Okay, go look it up. Brad, you remember it? Okay, so yeah, this happened a little bit more than a year ago. Now, I guess the policy in Iowa was that, the policy was, freedom of religion, and therefore any religious institution that wanted to put on a public display in the government building was authorized to do so if they, filed the proper permit or whatever, and the Church of Satan did that. It was intended to be a mockery of that policy. And he recognized it for what it was. It was an expression of evil. And so he did something about it. And so as the story unfolded, what happened was he was essentially placed on probation. And so he didn't have to serve any time. I think he did have to pay a fine or something like that. But the reason why the chapter opens with the story of him is because it's an illustration of an individual responding to an act of pure evil with a sense of holy and righteous indignation, which is exactly what we see Ransom do in response to the unman. Lewis refers to it as perfectly unmixed and lawful hatred. Perfectly unmixed and lawful hatred. You might remember this point in the storyline when Ransom is actually physically fighting the unman. He realizes this is the only way that he can actually stop him from overcoming the Green Lady with his temptations. And so in the course of the conflict, he realizes his feelings towards the unman are pure hatred now. But there's also a sense of satisfaction knowing that it's okay for him to hate this being because this is the embodiment of pure evil. This creature here is no longer Weston. It's no longer human. It deserves his complete and unrestrained hatred because it is the manifestation of evil. Now, the chapter explains how did Weston get to this place where he completely lost his humanity. It talks about his moral and psychological descent. So it begins with Weston in Out of the Silent Planet. You may remember the ideology of Weston, the character described in Out of the Silent Planet. So the story goes, Weston and the other character, Divine, who doesn't show up in Perelandra, but he does show up as a central character in That Hideous Strength, which we're going to start looking at next week. They kidnap Ransom. They put him on board their spaceship. But as we first meet Weston, they were attempting to kidnap somebody else. This young man with special needs, mentally handicapped. Weston thought that this person was not fit for society, that in a civilized society, this kind of person would have been sterilized or done away with or whatever. And so we see from the beginning Weston has an ideology that fits social Darwinism. Are you familiar with the idea of social Darwinism? That, different like classes or races of people occupy different rungs on the ladder of humanity. And so he views people as instruments, as objects for achieving other ends. That's where his utilitarianism comes in. Once they arrive on planet Mars, we see that Weston has much greater ambitions. His goal is to advance the human race to the farthest reaches of the universe, to conquer other civilizations and species in the name of whatever humanity is going to become. And so it's a form of hyper-colonialism. But then, once he arrives on Perelandra in the next novel, we see that his thinking has undergone a transformation, an evolution. And so he had gone from this sort of sense of humanism without human rights, if we could say, to a more advanced but also more diabolical ideology, which has historically been called like vitalism. It's associated with thinkers like George Bernard Shaw, Henri Bergson, Arthur Schopenhauer. This idea that there is a life force in the universe that is propelling everything forward towards we don't know what, but it's this inexorable evolution. There's no like good or evil, like fixed categories, like a dichotomy between good and evil within this worldview. And Weston himself affirms that God and Satan are our mythological constructs for what is ultimately the same thing in his understanding. And this is also, in modern days, we'd call this an expression of transhumanism. If you're familiar with the movement of transhumanism, I actually taught a whole lesson on that topic last summer as part of our class on Christianity and technology. But it's the idea that we can sort of transcend our own limits as human beings. We can jumpstart our own evolution to the next stage of development by using technology, anti-aging technology, cybernetic technology, genetic enhancement. Through all these modes of technology, we can actually become something greater than ourselves. We can even perhaps deify ourselves. This is Weston's ideology, and Ransom sees this as pure evil. Once he reaches this stage in his ideology, it's at that point when he calls upon this so-called life force to enter into him, which it does in an act of demonic possession. And at that point, Ransom realizes, you might remember this picture from last time, it's at this point it dawns on Ransom that he's no longer dealing with Weston anymore. The Weston that he knew is gone. This is now a demonic power, indistinguishable from Satan himself. And so it's at this point where the descent is complete. And there's a great description of this character in contrast to other literary depictions of Satan by other great authors of the past. Here's how the author puts it. This is Bethel McGrew, the author of this chapter. It says, Lewis sets his Satan apart from Christopher Marlowe's suave Mephistopheles. So that if you're familiar with Dr. Faustus, that's the book being referred to here. Or John Milton's tragically brooding Lucifer from his book Paradise Lost. This Satan, the Satan of Lewis, can be graceful and eloquent when the moment suits. It even offers arguments to the Green Lady that are more subtly dangerous than Satan's arguments in Paradise Lost because they appeal to the Green Lady's virtues, where Milton's Satan appeals to Eve's vices. So we just talked about that in the previous chapter. However, in Lewis's story world, subtle grace and eloquence are not of the devil's essence. Unlike many villains who play stupid on the outside, but are really dastardly clever beneath, Lewis's Satan is, beneath it all, an idiot. So there's a scene that stood out to me in the novel Perelandra, where it was like after the Green Lady had dismissed them both, and it's nighttime, the unman is next to Ransom saying, Ransom, Ransom, Ransom. And when Ransom responds, like, what? The unman says, nothing. A few moments pass. Ransom, Ransom. And Ransom responds, what is it? What do you want? And he says, nothing. And Ransom comes to realize that the unman is going to just constantly pester him with saying his name over and over again 1,000 times. Or every time he responds, he'll just say, nothing. Why is he doing that? Because deep down, he's just an evil child. He just wants to torment Ransom. He's having fun with it, just like he has fun mutilating these little frog-like creatures on Perelandra. You would think that there's something more intelligent, more clever deep down underneath, but it's not. He's really just an evil child deep down. That's the depiction of evil that we see in Perelandra. And this is why, in the end, Ransom feels permission to utterly hate this creature, because there is nothing redemptive about it. It is the embodiment, the manifestation of pure evil, and therefore it deserves to be hated. It is the proper object of holy hatred. And so that's why he pummels him. This does raise a theological problem for us, though, as Christians. Because what does Jesus say about how we treat our enemies? Jesus says to love your enemies. And Lewis wrestled with this question as well. So we actually read in some of Lewis's letters to his brother during World War II, they talk about, the rise of Hitler. And they say, how are we as Christians supposed to respond to someone like Hitler? I mean, he's about as evil as it gets. How are we supposed to love someone like Hitler? I think this is a real challenge for us today, too, isn't it? I mean, think of the most evil figures on the world stage today. I'm not going to name them, but think about whoever these characters may be, what should be our posture towards them as Christians? Do we love them? Do we hate them? I mean, yes, Jesus says love your enemies, but doesn't the Bible also include imprecatory psalms? You know what I mean by imprecatory psalms? The psalms of cursing. They get pretty vivid in their description of the judgments against the enemies of God. Can we really pray for that? That judgment would fall upon our enemies? There is a tension here. And this is how the author highlights it. In the end, for Ransom, as knightly guardian of the Green Lady and her planet, both fighting and hatred will have their place. He will fight the sinner, hating his sin, and eventually hating the thing sin makes of him. While Lewis's exhortation to love our enemies is sorely needed in the present moment, so too is his counsel that sometimes concrete opposition to the forces of evil is called for. What does this mean for us as Christians? This is a challenge for us. We are called to oppose evil. And within, the Reformed tradition, there is a proper place for force, for violence, the just war theory and all that. So there may be a proper place for that on proper occasions. But when it comes to hating our enemies, the Bible tells us that as long as there is hope for redemption, we should love our enemies. But for those who are the enemies of God, there will be nothing remaining for them but judgment. But we don't know who those people are. From our human perspective, we don't know if a person has crossed that point of no return. And so here on earth, we pray for repentance, we pray for their conversion, but in the end, we also pray that God's justice would be done. And so there is a tension, I think, that we're left with as Christians. Absolutely. That's right. There is a tension we feel because to love somebody means to oppose their sin, right? So think of someone that you love who is caught up in a sin struggle that they are denying. Our proper response as Christians is to say, because I love you, I have to oppose this sin in you. They may or may not respond to that in repentance. That's not our ability, though. That's not our job. That's the work of the Holy Spirit within them. But God has not told you who he's chosen for redemption and who he's chosen for destruction and condemnation. So we pray for our enemies. We love our enemies to the very end. But in the end, we do pray that God's justice will prevail. There's a tension there that we're left with, but that is what the Bible calls us to. And so for the next chapter, we're moving into our final chapter here, which is about the topic of pleasure. So this is the chapter that is written by Rhys Laverty, the editor of the book. And he opens with this quote by the Green Lady, where the Green Lady says, "Every joy is beyond all others. The fruit we are eating is always the best fruit of all." There is a recurring theme in the book of Perelandra about the concept of pleasure. And so we're going to unpack exactly what's the significance of pleasure in this novel. The author, though, opens with a couple of questions. First of all, he asks the question, why set a story in paradise? Think about it. Most of the great stories that we know of involve some kind of conflict, right? In order for a good story to unfold, there has to be some sort of antagonist. There has to be some sort of evil, enemy, a villain. But if you're set in paradise, You're not going to get that. Now, of course, we see there is a conflict that unfolds in Perelandra, but often the people who keep coming back to the novel Perelandra, the ones who say they love it most of all the books in the trilogy, probably is personally my favorite as well of the 3 books in the Ransom trilogy. The reason why people often say they keep coming back to Perelandra is not necessarily because of the conflict, although that's a great part of the story, but it's to experience what would it be like to be a fallen person in an unfallen world. That's Ransom's experience in Perelandra. He's a human being. He's the son of Adam. He's tainted by original sin himself, but he experiences a world that knows no sin. It is pure delight. It is pure pleasure. Have you ever wondered what would that be like for you? What if you could get in a time machine and go back to the Garden of Eden? How awesome would that be? It'd also be a little bit fearful, wouldn't it? Because you're like, am I worthy of such a thing? No, you're not, right? But what would it be like to taste of the original fruit, the permissible fruit in the Garden of Eden? That would be a pretty cool experience, wouldn't it? That's what Perelandra invites us to imagine, to be a fallen creature in an unfallen world, and to ask the question, what would unfallen pleasure be like? So that's the central question. Now, this does raise another question for Lewis readers in particular, because, for one, we have to ask the question, is this a useful question to ask in the first place? To ask what would life be like in an unfallen world? Isn't that just getting caught up in vain speculation? Isn't this unhelpful? Because this is not the reality that we're actually living in. Why would we ask questions about life in an unfallen world when that's not the world we live in? That life was lost. That world was lost. So shouldn't we have both feet on the ground and ask, what is this world like and how are we to respond to this world? Well, the author, Lavery, he says there are 2 potential dangers that we could fall into when it comes to exercising speculation. One is complete denial, to say that this is a useless question and therefore I'm not even going to believe the topic itself. Think about, for example, the Sadducees, as described in the New Testament. You guys know about the theology of the Sadducees, the Jewish leaders in first century Israel. So they were like the aristocratic class in Jerusalem. What they had in common theologically, though, was they only accepted the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and they did not believe in the doctrine of the resurrection. They thought that the doctrine of the resurrection was just silly speculation about the afterlife. And because they refused to even speculate on the question, they denied the doctrine itself. That would be one response to speculation. There is another danger, though, which is to go into excessive detail about questions that the Bible doesn't explicitly address. And we need to be on guard against that as well. Because there are some things that God simply has not revealed to us and does not tell us to search into. But I think there is an appropriate godly place for speculation in the sense that it helps us to clarify reality. Because when we can clarify the boundary between reality and unreality, it gives us a clear sense of the world we are living in. And so I think that's exactly what we see Jesus do in his response to the Sadducees. He actually, when they ask him about the resurrection, you remember the story that they posed about the woman whose husband died and then she married his brother. He died, she married the other brother, and there's 7 brothers or something like that. They all died. So with the resurrection, who is she going to be married to? What does Jesus say in response? He doesn't say, well, that's just a speculative question and it doesn't deserve an answer. He gave an answer. Remember what the answer was? Well, there's not going to be marriage in heaven because we're going to be like the angels. He gave an answer. It was a valid question to ask. Now, for them, it was a bad faith question because they were trying to trap Jesus. But the point that we learn from this is it's still okay to ask questions about heaven. We're not going to get all the questions answered necessarily, like what types of food are we going to eat? Will we have to go to the bathroom in heaven? Like, are we going to have memories of our earthly life in heaven? I don't know the answers to these questions. There's a lot of questions that we're not going to get answered on this side of heaven. But there is a proper place for asking questions like this. Another point to consider as we study pleasure in C.S. Lewis is, does C.S. Lewis seem to take a dim view of pleasure? Especially when contrasted with the concept that Lewis calls joy. Now, I'm saying joy with a capital J, which for Lewis has a special definition. Does anybody know what Lewis means by capital J, joy? I've talked about it before. Well, his wife. So yes, but no. That's not the joy I'm talking about here. That's a great point, though, John. His wife was named Joy. No. Before he even met Joy, he wrote an autobiography called Surprised by Joy. What does joy mean there? Join the Lord. You're on the right track. Yes. He connects it with, there's a German word that he often associates it with. Sehnsucht. Do you remember me using that word before? It means like yearn seeking. It's this sense of homesickness or nostalgia. It's the longing for something transcendent. Every experience we have in this world is like a signpost to something greater. And there are these moments where that sensation just grips us. It's like a holy aching. It's painful, but it's almost a pleasant pain. Just like think of whenever you experience homesickness, right? The homesickness itself indicates that there is a home. And that sense of home gives you pleasure, but there's also the ache of knowing that you're not there. Or the sense of nostalgia from an earlier stage or experience in your life. You ache to go back to that because you know there was a delight there. But the ache is there too because you don't have it right now. Joy, in C.S. Lewis's definition, is the same thing. It's this ache for something greater where all of our desires will be met. Our holy, supernatural desires, our greatest desire itself, which is the desire for God, will ultimately be satisfied. That's what Lewis means by joy. Now, if that's what we're wired with, and Lewis says we are, anybody who's honest with himself will admit that they've experienced this sensation before, doesn't that make pleasure pale in comparison? Wouldn't pleasure ultimately amount to nothing more than making mud pies in a slum? To borrow a quote from Lewis's essay, The Weight of Glory. Because Lewis will also say that we're far too easily pleased by pleasure. Don't pleasures on earth sometimes have a numbing effect to dull us to this greater longing for joy? Well, Lewis says there is a proper place for joy, or for pleasure. There are differences, but there are also similarities between pleasure and joy. So on the one hand, we'd say that joy itself is a desire, right? It indicates the lack of a satisfaction, right? We don't presently have an immediate vision of God. You know what theologians call the beatific vision, which is our highest pleasure? That's what awaits us in heaven. We don't have that yet, though. But we're hardwired with joy that orients us towards that desire, that orients us towards that object. So it points us towards the goal. It points us towards the good. But it itself is not the goal. This joy, as Lewis has defined it, is not the goal. And therefore, it's not an intrinsic good itself. It's instrumental. It's a vehicle that points us towards that greater good, which is God himself. On the other hand, we can say that pleasure is both a goal and it's an intrinsic good. God has given us creaturely, earthly pleasures for us to delight in. Now, they're not meant to be ultimate goods, so don't misunderstand me here. Only God is our ultimate good. But it is okay to delight in pleasure. God made us as embodied creatures so that we could experience pleasure. And so we see, therefore, that there are key differences between pleasure and joy. So as the author says, in Lewis's understanding, pleasure is more common. Think of all the earthly pleasures. A good meal, a marital relationship, a good conversation, all the things that we take delight in on earth. They're common. They have direct physical objects that they're associated with. But joy is different. It's more intense. It's more specific, and there's this experience of painfulness to it as well, because it's a desire that doesn't find fulfillment in the moment. But here's something that they both have in common. Both pleasure and joy direct attention away from the self and point to higher things. Think about the last time you rode on a roller coaster, right? It was fun, right? Hopefully. Hopefully you didn't get too sick. But think of that intense experience of, going on the roller coaster at high speeds, maybe like the loop-de-loop or whatever. At that moment, what happens when you say to yourself, am I having fun right now? What happens when you start to contemplate your fun? It's no longer fun, is it? You've just analyzed it, and you've missed the point. Delight, pleasure is supposed to take you out of yourself. That's what Lewis had said, about enjoyment, which we saw in the first chapter here. That's the idea that we're getting at here, right? It directs you outside of yourself to the object of pleasure. But once you start analyzing it, you lose it. Joy is similar in that regard as well. It directs us out of ourself to some other good, to some higher good. Pleasures do this too. Even our bodily pleasures. This is weird, okay? But we're going to have bodies in heaven, right? Will we have bodily pleasures in heaven? Yes, we will. I have no idea what they're going to be like. But they're going to be so much greater than the pleasures we have here on earth. Here's what Perelandra says. Lewis says these words. So this is a dialogue that Ransom has with another character. So according to Lewis, the narrator of Perelandra, this is the dialogue that happens after Ransom returns to earth from Perelandra. Sometime later, he's having a debate with a skeptic who dismisses the doctrine of the bodily resurrection, thinks it's all, nonsense. Like the idea that we're going to be embodied creatures, we're going to have resurrected bodies. That's ridiculous. Here's Ransom's response to that character. Oh, don't you see, you donkey, that there's a difference between a trans-sensuous life and a non-sensuous life. That, of course, directed McPhee's fire to him. So that's the skeptical character. We're going to encounter this character in That Hideous Strength later on. What emerged was that in Ransom's opinion, the present functions and appetites of the body would disappear. Not because they were atrophies, but because they were, as he said, engulfed. Atrophied, but because they were engulfed. Our bodily senses will not be done away with. They'll be transformed. Engulfed is the word used here. He used the word transsexual, which means something very different today. I remember, and began to hunt about for some similar words to apply to eating after rejecting transgastronomic. See the idea here, though? Like, our bodily senses will be elevated. They will be transcended. We're not going to get rid of them, but they're going to be reoriented towards something infinitely higher, infinitely better, infinitely more pleasant. That's why we're still going to have resurrection bodies in heaven, because those pleasures are good, which means the pleasures on earth are good too, because the pleasures on earth point towards the pleasures in heaven. They're like signposts. They awaken within us that holy longing. So I'm going to briefly summarize this because we are running out of time. But there are three main aspects of pleasure that the author highlights in, three main aspects of pleasure that the author highlights in the remainder of this chapter. First, naming the pleasure. That is, we have some kind of taxonomy about pleasure that we can derive from the novel Perelandra. So think about all of Ransom's experiences of pleasure on Perelandra. Ransom has all these different encounters of pleasure on Perelandra. Different types, different species of pleasure. Begins with the yellow gourd, which is like a taste unlike anything he's ever experienced on earth. The delight he has in tasting that yellow gourd can only be described as ecstatic. But there are other pleasures he experiences on Perelandra as well. Remember the bubble trees? What happens when he walks through a bubble and it bursts on him? It's like he awakens for the first time. It's so refreshing. It's a refreshing pleasure. Later on, he finds these green berries that are like 3 times the size of an almond. It's not that they awaken this sense of ecstatic pleasure like the yellow gourds do, but they fill him with a sense of contentment and satisfaction. Like, this is the bread of Perelandra. And when he tastes of it, it's like he feels like he has to say grace over it, because this is the food that sustains him. There's a satisfaction in just being nourished by this kind of food. Later on, when he's chasing the unman over the waves, he realizes he's extremely thirsty. And so he dunks his head in the water and he gulps up some of the ocean waves. And it's a quenching pleasure. It satisfies his thirst in a way that he's never experienced before. And he says in that moment he'd never been so happy. And then finally, after he's finally defeated the unman and killed him, he spends several days, possibly even weeks, next to this pool at the mouth of a cave where there are these grape clusters growing right next to him. And he wakes up, he eats some grapes, and then he falls asleep again and repeats this day after day. the grapes themselves are described as a life-giving pleasure. And so we have all these different types of pleasures experienced. Why do we have these different categories of pleasure on Perelandra? Because Lewis is trying to move us away from this reductionistic understanding of pleasure where it's like pleasure is only quantified. There's one kind of pleasure that you experience more or less intensely. In other words, we tend to reduce pleasure to the ecstatic type. But Lewis is telling us, no, there's so many different kinds of pleasures that God has given us. Here's how the author puts it. Lewis sees a quiddity in each pleasure, a thisness standing distinctly above the abyss of non-being, as if proud of what it is. The pleasures of Perelandra do just what Gerard Manley Hopkins, the 19th century English poet, said all created things do, as each one finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells. Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. Now, there's a lot to unpack there in the poetry there, but the idea here is there is a particularity in each pleasure, a specificity in each pleasure. And God has created us to enjoy that, to honor that. I'm going to have to kind of jump ahead here for the sake of time because we are running out of time here. So let me kind of just summarize this. He highlights the concept of restraining pleasure as well. So we do see at several moments in Perelandra when Ransom experiences this pleasure, it is so overwhelming because it's unlike anything he's encountered before, but at the same time he realizes, I can't do this again. To indulge in this pleasure a second time when it's not necessarily would be to turn it into a vulgarity. It would be like asking to hear the same symphony twice in a day. And so, here's how the author summarizes it. There are many Christian motivations for self-control. Love of God, love of neighbor, a desire to grow in Christ-likeness. Lewis here adds another, to honor the pleasure itself. So this is another lesson that we learn. And finally, embracing pleasure. One of the themes within Perelandra is the idea that the whole planet is like an ocean planet, right? And the islands are on the waves. And the one place that's off limits to the Green Lady is the fixed land. The theme of waves is significant for Lewis because it symbolizes God's providence. Taking what God gives you rather than clinging to what you expect or what you want. And that's what the fixed land symbolizes as well. It's clinging to the pleasure that you desire rather than the pleasure God gives you. Part of the Christian task of seeking contentment is to learn to accept what God gives us in his providence, to delight in the pleasures that he has given us, rather than seeking the pleasures that we would have for ourselves. And so it's kind of like summarize a key quote from Dante's Paradiso, where one of the characters says this regarding our relationship to God. In his will, there is our peace. That sea to which all beings move, the beings he creates or nature makes, such is his will. In other words, we find our greatest delight in accepting the providence of God. The pleasures, the struggles that he has given us in a fallen world, when we learn to accept these as from God's providential hand, that is when we find our greatest contentment. But the path to disobedience is to seek our own pleasures, to resist what providence gives us. And so these are the key lessons that we learn from Perelandra. So we've talked about enjoyment and contemplation, we've talked about evil, and we've talked about pleasure. There's a lot more I could have said on each of these chapters, but we are out of time. So for next week, we're going to start talking about that hideous strength. And we're going to spend 3 weeks on that hideous strength. I'm really looking forward to it. This is a big one. This novel is actually bigger than the first 2 novels combined. So, yeah, there's a lot to digest. That's why we're going to need 3 weeks on it. But as I wrap up, let me ask, any questions for me? Any comments? All right. Well, let me pray for us, and then we can get ready for corporate worship. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for your providence towards us, your kindness, and your grace. We thank you for the gift of pleasure. We thank you for the gift of our redemption through your Son, Jesus Christ, as well, and the hope of resurrection. Because as your word says, at your right hand are pleasures forevermore. I pray, God, that you would enable us to direct our thoughts towards you, to honor you in our lives, in our desires, in our speech, in our thoughts. I pray, God, that we would be faithful to your calling, that we would be willing recipients of your providence, and that we would be faithful ambassadors of your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.